Humanity has suffered pandemics of various sizes and degrees of severity throughout history. They were recounted in the Bible, occurred during the reigns of Roman emperors like Justinian, and even followed the First World War. But the time of the Black Death was something else entirely. The story of the Black Death is the story of a perfect storm. It was the focal point where the conditions of cities, expansion of the human population, the explosion of trade, and just the right political situations met. A powerfully lethal bacterium with an equally powerful vector of transmission. It went by many names: the Black Death, the Plague, the Great Mortality, and many others. But we know it so well because of its infamy. It was, after all, estimated that 30 to 40% of Europe died. But Europe was not alone. Africa, the Middle East, India, and East Asia were all in its path of destruction. In the end, it was suspected that worldwide, 200 million people died. A number so high that every outbreak before or since has not even come close. And this is especially impressive when you figure in that the world population at the time was approximately 500 million. Our story begins not in Europe, but far to the east. No one is exactly certain where the plague hides its lair, but many agree it lies somewhere where the Great Eurasian Steppe meets the Gobi Desert. Some claim it came from the Mongolian Plateau, from a region of the Great Desert itself. A place that Marco Polo on his journey would say that when a traveler became isolated, he would hear the voices of devils leading him astray, and the arid wind could make 1,000 fantasies throng to the mind. Whereas others felt it was on the banks of Lake Issyk-Kul, one of the deepest lakes in the world, where the contagion lay in wait. Now left to its own devices, the plague would infect small rodents and animals, and due to its lethal nature, it would not have easily been able to escape its isolated domain. But by the mid-14th century, the steppe was unified by the Pax Mongolica, and trade had rebounded on a massive scale. What was once a desolate and isolated land was now crisscrossed by the Silk Roads. It was traversed by throngs of merchants hoping to make their fortune. A multitude of trade stations and oasis stopping points were also established. What's more, to expedite messages that kept the bureaucracy of the Great Mongol Empire and its later fractured states working, the riders of the Yam, essentially a Mongolian pony express, were created. Suddenly, the plague had a mechanism to expand its domain, and it eagerly awaited its chance to do so. In the Crimean Peninsula, quite a distance to the west, was the city of Kaffa. In the mid-13th century, she was a backwater, rural, rustic, some would say primitive fishing village. But the world was changing, and trade, which had languished since the fall of the Roman Empire, had emerged as a powerful force. And a really good example were the Italian city-states, which vied fiercely with one another for monetary hegemony. Nothing would stop them from expanding their bottom line. The quote-unquote crusaders of the Fourth Crusade, jumping over the walls of Constantinople in 1204, gave testament to that. Now to quote a Ferengi rule of acquisition, number 95, in case anybody's interested, expand or die. Thus, in 1266, the Genoese arrived at Kaffa and set to work making it a city to be reckoned with. By 1340, she boosted a population of 80,000 people, buildings dotted the horizon, her market was a flurry of activity, and the docks of Kaffa were renowned to house over 200 ships. The location was perfect for the business savvy. The Silk Roads ran just to the north and divided into several paths before going into Europe. The Volga and the Don rivers were relatively nearby, adding to her commercial sphere of influence. And from her warm water port, ships would come and go from Constantinople, the Levant, Italy, and as far away as Iberia. In a short period of time, Kaffa had blossomed into a major focal point for bringing in luxury goods from both east and west. But, as is the case so many times in history, one civilization's success usually comes at the expense of her neighbors. The Mongol Empire was one of the largest land empires in history. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, it had fractured into 4 separate khanates. Each had their own agenda and modus operandi, but don't let the division fool you, each khanate was still very powerful. Of which the Golden Horde exercised authority over the Crimea. To them it was a small portion of their vast realm. Now the armies of the Golden Horde were comprised to a certain extent with the Tartars. This was a nomadic tribe from eastern Mongolia that were conquered in the days of Genghis Khan. They had been integrated into the Mongolian armies and helped with the western expansion of the empire. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde relied on the Tartars to help govern their land. Now to put this all into context, Kaffa, and for that matter the Genoese presence, existed only because the Golden Horde allowed it. The land on which the trading city flourished was essentially a grant for the purposes of enriching the Khanate's bank account. But for the 2 decades leading up to the early 1340s, political, economic, and religious friction between the Mongols and the Genoese were mounting. Thus, by the year 1343, very little was needed to ignite a precarious situation into open hostility. Not too far from Kaffa was the trading city of Tana. It was nestled at the mouth of the Don River and renowned as being the jump point one takes to get to China. It was in this city that a small angry exchange on a market street blossomed into a full-blown riot, resulting in spilled blood. And to be specific, a Muslim died at the hands of an Italian, or at least as the tale goes. Well, either way, the story got out, and the local Mongol Khan, a man by the name of Yani Beg, decided to arrive at the city gates and brought with him an impressive Tartar army. Under the auspices of being a defender of Islam, he demanded that the city capitulate. Now, in standard Mongol fashion, a besieged city had the option of either adhering to the terms of surrender completely, or taking their chances with fighting back, which usually resulted in the city and its people being wiped from the surface of the earth. The Genoese opted for the latter option and responded to Yani Beg's terms with a particularly insolent response. In retrospect, perhaps this wasn't the best idea. The attackers, not expecting this kind of response, laid into Tana with a vengeance, and the city was quickly overrun. However, some of the defenders managed to escape and then ran for their lives back to Kaffa. The Tartar army pursued very closely. They were fully engaged to punish the Italians for their insult of resistance. To them and their Mongol Khan, these arrogant, decadent Genoese no longer had a right to exist in the Khanate any longer. But as I've mentioned before, Kaffa was an impressive city and her city walls were equally impressive, and thus the Tartar army and her Khan had to settle in for a siege. This was going to be a really long siege, and as it dragged out, something else was coming in on the heels of the Tartar horsemen. By 1346, tales of a strange disease had begun to filter their way west. Most of the stories were ignored, but they told of entire areas being destroyed and population centers being wiped out. Vast tracts of China and India lay dying of a mysterious pestilence, and the disease, like the stories about it, were making their way west. By early 1346, Russian chroniclers had recounted that the shores of the Caspian Sea were affected. In less than a year, it had spread across the Don and the Volga rivers, descended into the Crimean Peninsula, and onto an unsuspecting Tartar army. It didn't take long before the encampment was infected, and even less time before the besiegers began to die en masse. For the Genoese, protected by their city walls, this affliction was heaven sent. To them it was nothing less than their god's retribution against the heathen race. And if they had any faith in this belief, they were soon to find out just how wrong they were. The situation in the Tartar camp was degrading by the day, to the point where more people were dying than could be easily attended to. The scene, if one could imagine, was that of putrid, swollen corpses stacked like cordwood as far as the eye could see. But perhaps what motivated the survivors to action was not so much the sight, but rather the disgusting, gut-wrenching stench. The Khan at this point, disgusted and revolted by the smell, gave the command to load the corpses onto catapults and then had them launched into the city. His hope was that the smell would accomplish what his army couldn't, that is, to drive the inhabitants to surrender. Now keep in mind that the bodies were well into the phases of decomposition by the time they were weaponized. What's more, as the body rots, gases form within the various layers, fascia, and internal organs. It essentially putrefies. Thus, when it's launched with sufficient velocity and upon hitting a stone structure at the end of their trajectory, they wouldn't just impact and fall down. Rather, some would explode into chunks and aerosolized fragments, spraying an entire area and showering those unfortunate enough to be below. This went on for weeks. The city was essentially inundated with remains. The rats that were infesting the camp would follow the scent in short order, and with them, the plague entered the city. The Genoese, who were once confident behind their defenses and were scoffing at the enemy, now saw the dying commence once again. But this time, it was in their own streets, their own buildings, and in their own homes. What made the plague especially lethal was that it had an almost perfect vector for transmission. That is, the rats and fleas that carried it were well suited to allow it to spread. The black rat, or Rattus rattus, thought to be one of the major species involved in transmission, evolved in Asia approximately 10 to 15,000 years ago. Now, while it's half the size of its cousin, the brown rat, it compensates with its ability to reproduce. And what do I mean by this? Two rats mating continuously for 3 years can lead to a population of over 3 million. It is also an extremely resilient creature. It can climb nearly vertical surfaces, enter through openings a quarter-inch thick, and survive a fall of 5 stories. And by the way, rodent comes from the Latin rodere, meaning to gnaw. And as such, its powerful jaw can cut its way through lead, adobe, and unhardened concrete. Medieval city walls simply didn't stand a chance. Now, once inside a city or on board a ship, it can exhibit problem-solving intelligence. After establishing a nest or a den, it purposely creates an escape route before cautiously foraging for food. Indeed, it essentially conducts reconnaissance, changing the areas that it explores and adapting quickly to any change in its environment. But perhaps its most unsettling aspect is that it serves as an almost perfect reservoir for fleas. The oriental flea, known as Xenopsilla chiopsis, is also called, for obvious reasons, the rat flea. It has a preference to get its blood meal from a rat or other rodent, but if that source is limited or exterminated, it's happy to try something else. And while it's waiting for something else to come on the menu, it has a certain degree of patience. This flea can endure for more than a month without a host. And during this time, it can live on clothing, baggage, fur, hair, or for that matter, corpses that are catapulted through the air. Once a target is sensed, its powerful hind legs allow it to jump over half a meter. And once it lands, its exceptional bite can penetrate directly into the bloodstream of its host, where it can suck up a meal. Now, in a normal flea, this blood would flow without interruption into the flea's stomach. Plague-infested fleas, on the other hand, were a completely different story. Once infected, the plague bacterium would multiply within the flea itself, blocking its foregut, and more importantly, its ability to ingest a meal. This would make the flea even more voracious, resulting in multiple bites. And with each bite, the plague bacteria would be regurgitated into the host. Now this brings us to our main culprit. The bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and to emphasize, this is not a virus. Viruses are smaller, work on a different mechanism, and their infectivity is distinctive. Once Yersinia pestis is inside the human host, it reproduces aggressively. Using its own unique enzymes, it can invade organs and a lymphatic system. This system, by the way, is crucial to the body. It is one of the key members of our immune defense and is responsible for eliminating foreign contagion. But for the purposes of the plague, it becomes its new home, which can seem a little counterintuitive. The reason for this is that the plague is extremely adaptive, which allows it to evade the otherwise very competent human immune system. And while the immune system is busy chasing its own tail, Yersinia pestis spreads from lymph node to lymph node to lymph node and multiplies at a ferocious rate. But of course, for the defenders of Kaffa with no knowledge of germ theory, epidemiology, and no insight on how this was spreading, not to mention that antibiotics would not come around for, 600 years, this was nothing less than a glimpse into the apocalypse. By April of 1347, there was very little left of the Tartar army around Kaffa. By the time of the spring rains, the straggling survivors had retreated. Many who left were infected and took the plague with them to other destinations. However, by then the contagion had made its way well into the city, and there the scenario had become equally appalling. John Kelly, in his book The Great Mortality, does a great job of describing what the situation in the city was like before the Tartars left. Quote, "As the death toll mounted, the streets would have been filled with feral animals feeding on human remains, drunken soldiers looting and raping, old women dragging corpses through rubble, and burning buildings spewing jets of flame and smoke into the Crimean sky. There would have been swarms of rodents and piles of bodies stacked like cordwood in every public square, and in every eye a look of wild panic or dull resignation. The scenes in the harbor, the only means of escape in besieged Kaffa, would have been equally horrific. Surging crowds and sword-wielding guards, children wailing for lost or dead parents, shouting and cursing, everybody pushing towards teeming ships. And beyond the melee on the departing galleys, prayerful passengers hugging one another under great white sheets of unfurling sail, ignorant that below deck in dark, sultry holds, hundreds, if not thousands, of plague-bearing rats were scratching themselves and sniffing at the cool sea air." End quote. As I've said before, Kaffa was an impressive city. Equally impressive was her port, which could shelter nearly 200 ships. At this point in history, panic had engulfed the populace, and getting out was the only thing the inhabitants could think of. Thus, it wasn't just one Genoese galley that managed to depart, but several. Their journey would take them south through the Black Sea, then through the narrow Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. Their destinations were the great ports of the entire Mediterranean world. The world that the plague was sailing into seemed almost perfectly set up for a pandemic. From the 13th century onward, trade had expanded like never before, and not just on land, but also on the water. The sea lanes and the trade routes of the Mediterranean had prominently emerged, not just as a simple means to expand a country's income, but vital to the success of any emerging power. Thus, ports and harbors would grow to facilitate this need and became strategically crucial as the world made its first steps into becoming a global community. In time, it became a relatively common sight to see luxury goods from China being sold in Italy, France, or even England. Now, the time leading up to the 14th century was also a period of dramatic gain in the human population. This was a phase of prolonged favorable weather, which meant impressive crop yields, and the extra food would mean more mouths could be fed. Europe was estimated to have peaked someplace in the 75 to 80 million range. But all good things come to an end, and by the 1330s the weather had changed for the worse, and this was accompanied by various ecological disasters like drought, earthquake, and flooding. And just as a side note, these ecological disasters would have a dramatic effect on instigating rat migrations. This was a time when crops began to fail, malnutrition became more rampant, and the rural populations began to flock to the cities. Urban planning was not able to keep up with this massive influx, and so cities became disorganized, overcrowded, and even more filthy. City dwellers could not effectively keep up with all the garbage that they produced. Refuse would fill every corner, and sewage was literally thrown out the window on the streets below, which now functioned as open sewers. What's more, the early 14th century was also one of the most gruesome periods when it comes to military history. John Kelly, in his book The Great Mortality, brings this to life. Quote, "From Kaffa to Vietnam and Afghanistan, no human activity has been more closely associated with plague than war, and few centuries have been as violent as the 14th. In the decades before the plague, the Scots were killing the English the French the Flemings, and the Italians and the Spanish each other. More to the point, in those savage decades, the nature of battle changed in fundamental ways. Armies grew larger, battles bloodier, civilians were attacked with more frequency, and property was destroyed more routinely, and each helped to make the medieval battlefield and the medieval soldier more effective agents of disease." End quote. The ships that sailed from Kaffa had multiple destinations. In the summer of 1347, some of these ships arrived at Constantinople. Here, the plague disembarked and killed an estimated 50 to 70% of the population. The court scholar, Demetrios Kydones, who was an eyewitness, remarked, quote, "Every day we bring out our own friends for burial, and every day the city becomes emptier and the number of graves increases. Men inhumanely shun each other's company for fear of contagion. Fathers do not bury their own sons, and sons do not perform last duties for their fathers." End quote. From the great city on the Bosphorus, it began to spread overland in two directions. To the west, it spread through Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, and then upwards towards Poland. And to the east, it dispersed across Asia Minor before heading into Persia. But the Genoese plague ships of Kaffa weren't done yet. They continued to sail south through the Dardanelles and onwards to ports in Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and then all the way across to Sicily. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived in Messina. It was here that the Great Mortality first seemed to appear in the historical narrative. The local authorities who were first to witness these incoming ships saw scores of men and women encrusted with lesions, many in the various stages of dying. Stacks of dead bodies were later discovered below deck. After a period of deliberation, the decision was made to turn these ships out, but by then, it was much too late. The Black Death invaded the city with unfettered enthusiasm, and then spread through the entire island, killing on average a third of the population. As before with Constantinople, it began to spread over land. In very short order, it had jumped the Strait of Messina and then began to make its way up the Italian boot, arriving in Rome a few months later. In retrospect, it was estimated that the plague, on average, moved approximately 2.5 miles a day, crossing rivers, traversing over mountain passes, and entering nearly every city it came across. But that was on land. The aforementioned plague ships that were forced to depart Messina went on to new destinations as well. The sailors on board, who had somehow managed to survive, carried on business as best they could, trading their goods as they went. They still had a bottom line, after all. Thus, these very same ships would move on to Marseille, Genoa, Malta, Tunis, and ports in Spain, Sardinia, and Corsica, to name a few. Their home city of Genoa, with an estimated population of 90,000, was infected in late November, where 30 to 40% would die. Marseille would fare no better and would serve as the major entry point for all of France. It's from here that the plague would move north towards Avignon, where it would arrive in January of the next year. It was also in January of 1348 that Venice, with her estimated population of 120,000 people, also got hit. The Venetian response was vigorous and highly structured. Some would even consider it almost brutal. The Great Council and the Doge, Andrea Dandolo, declared that all entering ships were to be seized and searched. The ships that were found to have even the slightest indication of plague were immediately set to the torch. On a nearby island, isolated from the rest of the population, a strict quarantine was established. In fact, the very word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, which was the amount of time that ships and their crew were held in isolation. A municipal fleet of gondolas were created which traversed the canals, chanting, Corpe morti, essentially, bring out your dead. This rather macabre chant summoned the population to throw their dead bodies into the waiting ships below. The corpses were then systematically interred in specialized burial locations. Now, despite these measures, the death rate soared to over 60%. It was later estimated that over 72,000 people died. This death rate was so high and so rapid that in many instances the complex network of society would either fail or vanish entirely. But once again, the Venetian government stepped up to the challenge as society began to disintegrate all around her. Near draconian measures and martial law were invoked. Civilization would endure, but it held on by a very tiny thread. However, as Venice desperately grappled to maintain order and to save the rest of her population, the bubonic plague had already moved on. The decade that led up to 1348 was a very difficult time for Florence. Flood, disease, drought, and famine had all visited the city. Warfare engulfed the land as Genoa was up in arms against Venice, and the papacy likewise with the Holy Roman Empire. What's more, Edward III of England, who had used Florentine banks to fund his portion of the 100 Years' War, had defaulted on his loans. The magnitude of these loans was so immense that it caused financial ruin in the Italian city. And thus, it was in the spring of 1348 that the plague also arrived. The 100,000 citizens of the city had no idea what was about to hit them. Arising from what seemed like thin air, the stigmata of purple-black swellings in the armpit and the groin, known as buboes, began to suddenly appear, and this seemingly on everyone. This was followed by bloody vomit, high fevers, delirium, and in most situations, an agonizing death. As seen before, society began to break down as entire families and neighborhoods would be wiped out. And keep in mind, some of this would only happen in a few days. Panic on an almost unimaginable level would grip the city. Riots and looting would spread like wildfire. Those that could attempted to barricade themselves away, while afflicted and dying people were simply abandoned to their fate. And many would try desperately just to escape the carnage altogether. By most estimates, 50%, that's 50, of the population perished. Giovanni Boccaccio, a writer who some say lived in plague Florence, gave a testament of what he saw. Quote, "A great many people died who would have perhaps survived had they received some assistance. Indeed, the number of deaths reported in the city, whether by day or night, was so enormous that it astonished all who heard tell of it, to say nothing of the people who actually witnessed the carnage. Thus, a great number departed this life without anyone at all to witness their going. Few indeed were those to whom the lamentations and bitter tears of their relatives were accorded." Boccaccio continues, quote, "Such was the magnitude of corpses that huge trenches were excavated in the churchyards, into which new arrivals were placed in their hundreds, stored tier upon tier like ship's cargo, each layer of corpses being covered with a thin layer of soil, till the trench was filled to the top." End quote. The term plague pit would later be coined, but even more gruesome would follow. As the heavy spring rains would come, they would unearth the remains and then wash them about the city. Later, there are accounts where these very same remains would then serve as the food source for rats, pigs, and even dogs, the sight of which could have been nothing less than apocalyptic. The plague had an absolutely astounding death rate. With an incubation time, that is the time of exposure to the onset of symptoms, anywhere between 1 day to 1 week, an infected individual who didn't have any symptoms was able to pass on the disease without even knowing it. There were 3 major known variants. The bubonic form was the least lethal. Once infected, a person would exhibit flu-like symptoms, most notably high fevers, followed by fatigue and cough, of which the latter could become very bloody. This would occur as Yersinia pestis, again the bacteria, made its way through the body's organs, causing some of them to shut down. There are even reports that those who were infected and in the latter stages of the disease would have an odor that was consistent with internal gangrene. Eventually, the contagion would make its way into the lymphatic system, accumulating in the lymph nodes. These nodes would swell, resulting in the characteristic plague boils, usually in the groin, the armpit, or the neck. Now, some of these nodes would grow immense and could cause major disfigurement. There are those who survived the plague whose necks were bent to the side permanently. Now, if these massively swollen lymph nodes were able to rupture through the skin, they would open up, spilling the fluid contents within, which of course would be teeming with bacteria and ready to infect another. In fact, for that matter, most fluid that was carrying the bacteria that was excreted from the body, that is, by coughing, bleeding, vomiting, etc., was infectious if it was touched, or even worse, if it was ingested. The mortality rate of the bubonic variant was approximately 60%, which gave you the best chance for survival if you had the plague. And yes, this does mean that there were those who had the plague who did manage to live through it. But again, that implies that you had this variant of the plague. Now, the pneumonic form occurred when the bacteria got into the lungs. People would start vomiting and coughing up blood almost immediately. This variant was extremely infectious and could be passed through the air. Transmission, as one can imagine, was more common in the wintertime when people were simply cloistered together. On average, one would have approximately 3 days to live once the onset of symptoms occurred. The mortality rate of this variant would run in the 95 to 100% range, depending on the region that you were in. Now, if you think that having a less than 5% chance of survival was bad, the last variant was the worst. If the bacterial count in the body reached maximum density and then spilled into the bloodstream, you would end up with the septicemic variant of the plague. The body would simply go into massive shock and shut down, and no one recovered from this. And to put this all into perspective, the time frame between beginning to feel ill and dying was approximately 14.5 hours. Family members would literally kiss their seemingly healthy loved ones goodnight, only to find them dead in the morning. Think for a second how this could possibly change one's worldview. And then take it a step further. Think what your mindset would be if you had absolutely no scientific knowledge of what was actually going on. The death that surrounded the individual would have been near impossible to grasp. The magnitude was just too much, but why was it so? The Black Death, as I've mentioned before, was a perfect storm. The plague was nothing new on the world stage. It had affected humanity before and would do so afterwards. The plague of Justinian, for example, in 541 to 542, which caused massive destruction, was also thought to be caused by Yersinia pestis. And yet, the death rate, the duration, and the extent of carnage in this and other epidemics was never as high as it was during the Black Death. The plague of the mid-14th century also had some unusual characteristics. It appeared to advance, albeit a bit slower, even during the winter months, which, if it was carried on fleas, doesn't make logistical sense, as most fleas would have died of the cold. What's more, this particular plague infected people at a rate that modern Yersinia pestis just doesn't seem to possess. Some forensic scientists today feel that this bacteria had some help. Aside from the warfare of the time, the condition of cities, the extent of trade routes, and an ideal vector of transmission, the Black Death may not have been alone. Indeed, it might have been the perfect storm of multiple pandemics at once. In retrospect, it has been hypothesized that the bacteria associated with anthrax and the virus tied to Ebola were also involved, both of which are lethal in their own right. Now, part of the reason why the death rate was so high was also associated with the immense physical geography that would be affected, that is, the entire continent of Europe amongst other continents. Plague would wash over one area only to return in another wave, coming from another direction. In this way, some areas of Europe would be hit several times, and in many cases, the second or even third wave could be even more devastating than the first. By mid-1348, the Black Death had been going strong in Europe for nearly a year. Avignon in southern France had run out of space to bury her dead. A wave of plague that originated in Constantinople had blazed a path into the Balkans, and Italy had been overrun, prompting the historian Giovanni Boccaccio to comment, quote, "One citizen avoided another, hardly any neighbor troubled about others. Such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity that brother abandoned brother, and very often the wife her own husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their own children as if they had not been theirs." End quote. Through the rest of 1348, at an average rate of 2.5 miles a day, the Black Death made its way north. Rural communities that were along the way were sometimes wiped out entirely. In some places, the destruction was so complete that nature would retake the land, and traces of civilization would only be rediscovered by aerial photography prior to the First World War. By June of 1348, the Great Mortality arrived in one of its most prominent hunting grounds, the great city of Paris. Her population was approximately 210,000 people, easily one of the larger cities of Europe. Once the plague had made its way in, it began to fester there, gaining in virulence. By the time it left a year later, over half the city was left silent and lifeless. But the plague was only getting warmed up as it continued its path north. It seemed that in the hot summer days, it acquired even more momentum, and make no mistake, its most destructive time was still ahead. By the late summer, 1348, a fisherman in the English Channel could see the plague flag flying from nearly every French town and village along the coast. It would not be long before the Black Death would engage in its most sinister work. A cross-channel invasion was imminent, as the battle for Britain would soon begin. The plague, after all, had killed in France and on the seas and the oceans. In England, it would do its work with a brutal efficiency never seen before. There, it would kill on the beaches and on the landing grounds. It would kill in the fields and the streets and the hills. And it would seem as if it would never surrender. As Avignon, Paris, Florence, and many other cities were running out of space to bury their dead, England was enjoying a relatively good summer in the year 1348. Her popular King, Edward III, had replaced the rather unpopular Edward II, who, let's just say, came to a rather unpleasant end, literally. Edward III had gone on to achieve glory against the French at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. His victorious troops would steadily bring back the spoils of war to the port of Calais, where they'd be shipped across the English Channel to an absolutely triumphant Britain. But this train of goods increasingly made its way through a French countryside where the number of cities displaying the plague flag would be increasing by the day. Plus, keep in mind that English wool at this point in history was in extremely high demand, and plague or not, trade continued relatively unabated despite the looming threat. English sheep, after all, in mid-1348, estimated at approximately 8 million, outnumbered English people by a decent margin. That commodity simply had to get out, as other goods needed to get in, and social distancing was just not a high priority. The Black Death came with a vengeance never seen before. Historians in retrospect feel that the plague came from Calais and landed on several fronts. Along the Channel coast, the Great Mortality arrived at Southampton, Portsmouth, and the small port of Melcombe, which is now a part of Weymouth. Another front began at Bristol, where it was suspected a ship from Gascony docked with a cargo of French wine. The effect of its landing was striking and immediate. The local monk, Henry Knighton, described it as, quote, "A cruel death took just 2 days to break out all over town. For many it was nothing less than sudden death." End quote. Now, from these two separate beachheads, one along the Channel coast and the other from Bristol, the plague began to move inland along the roads and the river systems. Now, whereas the average death rate in a city in continental Europe was approximately 33%, in England it would soar to an incredible 55%. And again, this is on average. Some cities would see as high as 80 to 90% of their population perish. Many towns and cities who could simply not bury their dead fast enough would resort to incinerating the remains. A traveler along an English road would see a nightmarish landscape of giant black smoke plumes emanating from every direction, with the ash of the dead raining down upon them. So many people died that industries were left abandoned, fields were untended, livestock would be dying by the thousands in the pastures, and the streets of small villages and towns would be overgrown and retaken by nature. By the late autumn of 1348, the two fronts combined together and then cut a swathe to London, which, as John Kelly, the author of The Great Mortality, would say, quote, "The sanitary conditions of the city were appalling, even by medieval standards." End quote. London at this time was estimated to have had 80 to 100,000 people, of which over half of them would be taken by a particularly sinister 1-2 punch. First, by the pneumonic variant, as the cooler weather of the fall and winter would drive people indoors and thus closer together. And then second, by the bubonic form in the spring, as the warming months brought fleas and rats back into action. But despite this alarming death rate, things were just getting started. For the rest of 1349, the plague advanced to the north, and just like in France, it overran one city after the next. But again, in England, it seemed to inflict death at an unusually high rate as it continued its relentless drive. And by the latter part of that year, it had arrived at the borders of Scotland. John Kelly, using primary source material, gives us the Scottish assessment of what happened next. Quote, "The Scots, who were still laboring under the impression that the plague was an English phenomenon, were enjoying themselves immensely in the summer of 1349. They were laughing at their enemies and swearing by the foul death of England. In March of 1350, the very next year, they amassed a large army in the forest of Selkirk near the English border. And of course, they did this with the intention of invading the whole realm. But before the attack could be launched, the, quote, revenging hand of God reached across the border and shattered the gathering Scots with sudden and savage death." End quote. Now, this would not be the only time an army would be annihilated. Far to the south, plague had arrived in the Iberian Peninsula as far back as 1348. It had come to the Emirate of Granada in 1349, and by 1350, the same year that the Scots were dying at Selkirk, the warrior king Alfonso XI of Castile was on the verge of taking Gibraltar and then had the plan to bring down the emirate once and for all. But instead, at the siege of Gibraltar, his army would be destroyed by Yersinia Pestis, and Alfonso XI would go down in history as the only reigning European monarch to die of the Black Death. Now keep this in mind, as the Castilian army got wiped out here by the plague, the Emirate of Granada would ironically be saved, and thus it would take another 150 years before the Reconquista would be finally completed. With such massive mortality descending on seemingly everyone, a shattered and desperate Europe began to look for answers. Many felt that this was divine retribution for the sins of humanity and turned to religion. Others looked to astrology, and in Paris, considered to be the pinnacle of medical knowledge, the learned 46 masters of the Paris medical faculty congregated and determined that the Black Death was caused by an unusual conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, which they determined happened at 1 in the afternoon on March 20th, 1345, and I'm assuming that's local time. Now, the learned masters got together and assembled a compendium to explain this further. Quote, "The first cause of this pestilence was and is the configuration of the heavens, which occurred in 1345 at 1 hour after noon on the 20th of March, when there was a major conjunction of the 3 planets in Aquarius. What happened, according to the masters in Chapter 2, was that many of the vapors corrupted at the time of conjunction mixed with the air and were spread abroad by frequent gusts of wind. This corrupted air, when breathed in, corrupted the substance of spirit, and thus the heat generated destroyed the life force." End quote. Now, keeping all this in perspective, it's good to point out that the scientific method, germ theory, and even the medical need for hand washing was still a ways in the future, not to mention things like IV fluid, vaccination, and antibiotics. The medicine of the time was based on ideas that ranged back to the time of Aristotle and Galen, who was a doctor who lived during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. As such, it was based on the 4 humors of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which could cause illness if they were unbalanced, and the preferred treatment was usually bloodletting. However, this method would usually result in the introduction of more infection and/or the loss of too much blood, which would usually hasten death. But when this didn't seem to work, new methods were developed. Doctors would lance the swollen boils, draining the extremely infectious contents out. Now, in some situations, this would actually work, but in others, more infection would simply set in through the new openings. In some cases, they would take this a step further. The buboes were lanced open, and then a concoction of herbs and human excrement was rubbed in. And as can be imagined, this didn't really work out very well either. Now, one theory that came about was the idea that the plague was an airborne vapor, a miasma. And the thought process was that this was something that could be countered by inhaling extremely pure air, hence the reason some people sought solace in the countryside, or it could be opposed by inhaling extremely foul air to offset some of the noxious odors. This led entire communities rushing to stick their heads into the local latrine. Now, along those same lines, drinking urine became very popular, and specifically non-plague victim urine developed into a treatment, and of course the procurement of this became its own cottage industry. For those rich enough and who decided not to drink urine, a crushed up sapphire that was ingested was also thought to work well against the plague. There were those who also employed fire. Initially, it was applied directly to the body. In some scenarios, hot pokers were even jabbed into the boils of those with the disease. I guess one way to look at it is that one person's treatment is another person's torture. But in other scenarios, fire was actually used as a means to ward off what was considered evil vapors. And of course, fire was also very effective at warding off fleas. Thus, the Pope at the time, Clement VI, would sit between 2 log fires when he was giving Mass. And for the record, he was noted to have survived the plague. Throughout Europe, quarantine would also more effectively be used. The extreme examples would include the city of Milan and a good majority of Poland. In those areas, anyone who showed the first signs of the Great Mortality would be literally walled up. In many cases, they'd be walled up alongside their own families within their own homes, which now became their own tombs. Now, as vicious and brutal as this may sound, Milan's death rate was only 15%, and Poland's rate was much lower than the rest of Europe. During the years of the Great Mortality, there were a lot of different treatment modalities that were developed, but perhaps the greatest legacy of medical intervention were the plague doctors. To look upon a plague doctor was a foreboding experience. There was a good chance that you were dying when you saw them. But their appearance alone was startling, as they wore the equivalent of a medieval hazmat suit. Donning a thick leather covering with solid boots and thick gloves, their bodies were nearly sealed off from direct contact. The bird-like masks were designed to shield their breathing, the beaks being full of herbs and flowers to neutralize some of the putrid odors. The eyepieces were of glass, but would later be filled with crystal and then dyed red in color, giving one an almost sinister gaze. And some of these would also be offset so that the doctor could not look directly at his patient, as the idea that eye contact could lead to contracting the disease became a thing. In many cases, these nightmarish bird-human hybrids would be the last thing a person would see. And unfortunately, most plague doctors are remembered by history as being nothing more than icons of death. But that said, the people who took up this job put their lives on the line and began to study what they saw. The old ideas that treating patients and medicine in general came under increasing scrutiny, and new methods at treating wounds, pain, and fever, along with investigating the disease itself, were developed. Now, even if they couldn't cure the Black Death, in many cases, these plague doctors still managed to ease the suffering of those that they treated. Now, not all would put their faith in medicine or science. Many also turned to religion for solace. But some would take this to an extreme. A movement known as the Flagellants emerged in late 1348 and early 1349 as the Black Death ravaged Europe. These men and women, in groups as high as 500, would engage in pilgrimages across the continent. As penance for what they perceived as the sins of humanity and a displeased God, they would whip themselves as they went. The whips, by the way, were composed of 3 or 4 ropes, each with a piece of metal or hooks embedded at the ends. Many would march naked. Others were dressed in white robes and hoods, sometimes with a red cross printed on them. A contemporary witness, the Dominican friar Henrici de Hervodia, would comment that the movement was like a race without a head, and would describe one of the members as, quote, "He stripped himself naked and beat his body and arms and legs till blood poured off of them. Then, in an ecstasy of pain and joy, he fell to his knees. And in his cold monk's cell, naked and covered in blood and shivering in the frosty air, he prayed to God to wipe out his sins." End quote. Officially, from a religious perspective, they were rejected by Pope Clement VI as being heretical. For the purposes of the plague, however, they served as a vector, moving the disease along their pilgrimage route. People along the way would know that the flagellants had come. The road that they took, after all, would be splattered with blood and entrails, not to mention the bodies of those who had died in the attempt to find remission for their sins. Now, increasingly, as the Great Mortality took more lives at an unprecedented rate, the various peoples of Europe began to look for someone to blame. The Jewish community of Europe would be one of the major scapegoats. The plague was put into the light of being an elaborate scheme where a vast underground Jewish network had poisoned all the wells. Many Jews were thus rounded up and faced torture to extract forced confessions, after which the pogroms began in earnest, of which the first major one occurred in Toulon on April 13th, 1348. Many would follow, almost throughout the entire breadth of Europe. Heinrich Trucius, the canon of Constance, would say, quote, "Within the revolution of 1 year, that is from All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1348, until Michaelmas, September 29th, 1349, all of the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burnt and killed." End quote. In Strasbourg, it was reported that half the Jewish population was stripped naked, marched into a local cemetery, and incinerated in a stone house. And in Brandenburg, they were placed on a giant grill and burnt alive. But even in these dark, tumultuous times, there were those who provided sanctuary. The city of Marseille in southern France, for example, offered a great deal of protection. The King of Poland, Casimir the Great, would take in Jewish refugees and even forbade persecution. Even the Pope, Clement VI, in a papal bull on July 6, 1348, would say, quote, "It cannot be true that the Jews are the cause of the plague, for it affects the Jews themselves." End quote. But even with the Pope's blessings, not all would listen. In some communities where the Jewish population was slightly less affected, they would be blamed for the plague and killed. And in other communities where it was mostly the Jews dying from the Black Death, The locals would justify killing them as completing God's work. And this would go on for years. By late 1349, upwards of 50 to 60% of the British Isles had succumbed to the plague. But this was not the only front. At 2.5 miles a day, it had crossed the Rhine, entering into what would one day be southern Germany, and then from there had advanced to the gates of Vienna. But it was able to cross on more than just land. On the North Sea, the Black Death took to the water and invaded Scandinavia. Ships would later be found adrift, with nothing on board except ravaged corpses. Bergen would be one of the first cities to be hit, but it would not stop there. It moved east, penetrating even into remote areas. To Setidal, a secluded village that was located high in the mountains, was so badly devastated that nearly everyone in it died. In fact, when a rescue party arrived in 1350, nearly a year later, the only survivor they found was a young girl named Ripe. The poor child, who due to her lack of human interaction and guidance, had reverted back into an animalistic existence. She had begun to hunt wild game like a wolf, and had lost the ability to communicate with words. Now, despite these harrowing stories, the plague would move on. By 1351, the Black Death arrived in Poland, but there it was not able to inflict as much damage. Cities were more spread out, and the king, Casimir III, again also known as Casimir the Great, had shut down the borders of his kingdom and had enforced a very strict quarantine. As I'd mentioned before, anybody in Poland who showed the slightest signs of plague were literally bricked into their homes. And just as a side note, there is one theory that says that Poland had an abundance of cats, which would help to curb the rat population and thus saved a good chunk of humanity. By 1352, the plague had made it to the gates of Moscow, but unlike the Grand Armée or the Wehrmacht, it continued to move east and back into the Eurasian steppe from where it came. Now make no mistake, Europe was left devastated in its wake. But by 1353, the Black Death was finally over. There is a famous statement, which I believe is from William Yeats, though many authors in history have said similar things. It goes, "The veneer we call civilization is only skin deep. Though we like to think that humanity is secure, our more barbaric tendencies lie just below the surface. And thus this statement implies that it only takes a nudge from some other stressor to knock us down several notches. You know, to blow us back into the Stone Age kind of thing." There may be a certain degree of truth to this, but as far as stressors go, the Black Death was perhaps one of humanity's greatest catastrophes. After all, it's estimated that a third of Europe did not survive the pestilence, and now historians feel that that number is woefully low. Worldwide, it's also thought that over 200 million people died. The fragile network of society in some places broke down or was destroyed entirely. And yet, civilization persisted, a new equilibrium was established, and some say Europe emerged in a better spot. With so many dead, the cost of labor skyrocketed and the cost of food plummeted. The landed gentry who ended up on the losing end of this one were now forced to pay higher wages. And peasants and serfs saw their standard of living increased. Indeed, some could even build up wealth to pass on to their children. Furthermore, somebody who was previously indentured to the land now had a better chance of leaving an unfavorable position and moving to a new location with the knowledge that they could be employed. With the need of labor in such high demand, even the position of women was elevated as some took on traditionally male roles. Some historians even go so far as to say that this was the beginning of the end of serfdom. This was going to be a time when old ideas and institutions that had previously wallowed in complacency were now put to the test. People began to take a very insightful re-examination of their own mortality. As such, art, literature,